All right, I guess we are ready to start. It's 5 o'clock European time. So welcome everyone. My name is Lars Stranegård. I am the president of the Stockholm School of Economics. And I'm really happy to see that the interest in this terrible issue is so substantial, that we have so many people logging into this. So I really want to welcome you to this seminar on the implications of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I guess we are all following the news almost like slaves, where we see a brutal Russian war machine that unprovoked really commits illegal abuses in which innocent people, including civilians and children, are affected and killed. And in the world of higher education, we are really have so many difficult questions, as I think many of you know. The Swedish government has called on Sweden's higher education institutions, of which SSE is one, to cease contacts and collaborations with state institutions in Russia and in Belarus. So higher education institutions are also urged not to initiate new contacts or commitments. So for example, SSE, through its membership in SEMS, has now paused student exchanges and collaborations with the Graduate School of Management that's in Petersburg University. And the same goes for our operations in SSE Russia. And at SSE, however, we are fortunate enough to have SITE, the Swedish Institute for Transitional Economies. And I think many of you know Torbjörn Becker, because he's, I guess you could say, sadly enough, all over the media right now. He's almost becoming a celebrity out of these tragic events. But at SITE, we have for many, many years now developed a lot of knowledge on the part of the world where the war now is raging. And there are truly no winners in this war. So Ukraine is suffering from the Russian bombardment, while Russia is experiencing the consequences of the sanctions on its economy. So these are just some of the examples, or some examples of the issues that we will explore today. So the setup is quite simple. It's due to the number of participants, you are all muted, but please feel free to submit any questions you have in the Q&A chat. There will be time for a brief Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And also we are recording this webinar, so it will be made available afterwards. So the setup is the following: that I will first leave the word to Jesper Roine. He's an associate professor and the deputy director at SITE. And he will moderate this entire session. And then after he has started his moderation, he is going to leave the floor to Torbjörn Becker, who is the director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics at Economics here at SSE. So without taking up more time on this, I'm going to leave it to the main individual. So I'm going to start and just give the word over to you, Jesper. So let's get going, and welcome once again.
Okay, so thank you very much, Lars, for the introduction and for organizing this event. As you said, it's true that we at SITE have for a very long time been following this region. One of our prouder achievements in all of this is that we've created a network in the region, the free network, consisting of a number of research institutes who collaborate on understanding better the economic and political situation in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. This includes research institutes both in Ukraine, in Russia, and also until recently in Belarus. But so, of course, recent events are affecting us both professionally, but also very much on a personal level. Many of our colleagues are suffering very difficult times now. So, of course, because of this, it feels that we, for many reasons, are in a good position to comment on what's going on, and we also have close contacts with individuals in the region. Being an economics institute, we of course focus on the economics issues. This is, however, a region where economics and politics and international relations are very much intertwined. So we'll have reasons to come back to this. As part of what the Free Network does, we also publish, since many, many years, we publish research-based policy analysis. And I would sort of like to invite you all to take a look at freepolicybriefs.org. You find well over 350 short policy briefs on various issues. And in the days to come, there will be more updates by ourselves, but also more importantly by people in the network who are close to this conflict and who will comment on various aspects of it. But as Lars said, there's one person who recently has been very much in the at least Swedish news and media commenting on this, and that's my colleague here at site, Torbjörn Becker. He has a background in at the IMF, so he's well aware of sort of both macroeconomics and international relations, and sadly enough of sanctions and various macro shocks and what this does to the economy. So he's for many reasons very well positioned to comment on the economic aspects of this. We've also been given some, or you, the audience, have been given the opportunity to pose questions beforehand. So I've received some of those questions. I've taken the liberty to weave them together, some of them, into a couple of talking points that we will start off with. But as was said before, you're very welcome to also use the Q&A function to pose more questions. And if we have time, we'll of course try to answer as many of those as possible. Also, I've been told that out of respect for everyone participating, we should stick relatively closely to the schedule. So we will really try to end on time in about 50 minutes or so. But given that short time frame for this very complex question, I would now like to invite Torbjörn to give a first kind of keynote presentation of the main issues, and then we'll get back and have a bit of a discussion and Q&A in about 25 minutes, half an hour or so. So please, Torbjörn, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you, Jesper. And also, of course, thanks to Lars and everyone organizing tonight. And as I think we all feel, it would be a much better world if we didn't need to have this discussion tonight. But unfortunately, this is not an option right now. I will give you a little bit of background first. I mean, this is, of course, why Russia thinks it can invade Ukraine. We all know, and we have some of us that are old enough grew up knowing that Russia, or then the Soviet Union, was a military superpower. And in this picture here, which I borrowed from the FT the other day, it's a basic comparison about what kind of military forces do Russia have compared to Ukraine. And it's no big surprise to anyone that the picture looks like this. One thing that was not in this article was, of course, that Russia is also a nuclear superpower with a world-leading 6,252 nuclear warheads backing up the rest of this picture. And some of you may not remember, but Ukraine also had nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union was dissolved, but gave them up in exchange of a security guarantee from Russia, the US, and UK. So this is a little bit of a historical background to where we are now, and also understanding how uneven the military powers are distributed here. So as many of you know, I'm not a military expert, so I will focus on economics and how the West is now using economics in response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And this is basically the picture that tells you how this is possible, because despite being a superpower militarily, Russia is not a superpower in terms of economics, as we can see here. The two bars are depicting GDP, gross domestic product, both in market exchange rates in US dollars and in purchasing power parity dollars. So basically you adjust for the fact that it's cheaper to live in Russia than in Sweden, for example. But as you can see in this picture, if we just compare Russia straight up to the US and the EU, the US and EU together has about 20 to 25 times the economy of Russia. So certainly Russia is a larger economy than Sweden. It's 2.5 times or so the Swedish economy, but in Russia you have 145 million people almost who needs to share this pie, and in Sweden we're 10. In this picture we can also see that Ukraine, of course, is not a very wealthy country, and GDP of Ukraine is even smaller than the Swedish GDP, despite the fact that Ukraine has over 40 million people living in Ukraine, or at least had, sadly enough. Okay, so this is why economics and sanctions are such an important discussion point at this point in time. One other piece that I wanted to share with you is also just that when we think about sort of the driving forces of the Russian economy and understanding how it works, it basically has probably one of the world's simplest macro models. If you want to understand how GDP develops, it's not simple in the sense of not being complex, but if you just want to understand how GDP and growth rates develop over time, you basically need one variable, which is plotted here in the black dashed line, which is international oil prices. And if you do your simple econometric models and you compare sort of the growth rates with changes in oil prices, you can explain pretty much 2/3 of Russia's GDP growth by one single variable, which is international oil prices. What is important to remember, though, is that to create growth in the Russian economy, oil prices need to rise. It's not enough that they are high, but it's basically increases in oil prices that generate growth in the Russian economy. So we can all understand that as a growth model has its serious limitations. And it's also one reason why the Russian economy, since basically the global financial crisis in 2008, has not shown very impressive growth, because without the changes in oil prices, Russia's GDP growth is normally 1.5 to 2% a year, which for a country at this income level is not sufficient to catch up with the West, basically. All right, so what can the West do then to try to persuade Russia that the cost of invading Ukraine is far too great, and in this world we're living in also, where the West is not able or willing to send military forces into Ukraine directly? Well, the sanction list has actually been very extensive already at this stage. The US and the EU and basically G7 countries have been quite effective in coordinating sanctions across a number of different areas. So first of all, we have the banking sector, where the West has introduced freeze on Russian assets abroad. They have banned several of the banks in Russia to be part of Western capital markets. There has been a lot of discussion about excluding Russia from the SWIFT network that facilitates transactions between banks. Later on here now in March, on March 12th, basically a number of Russian banks will be excluded from SWIFT. They have not included Sberbank and Gazprom Bank, which is number 1 and number 3 in size among the Russian banks, and we'll come back to that. And there's a bunch of other restrictions, basically making banking more complicated in Russia. The West has also frozen the central bank of Russia's assets in the West, which is quite a remarkable part of the sanctions package, I would say. On the fiscal side, there are also restrictions dealing with the National Wealth Fund, the Ministry of Finance, the Russian Direct Investment Fund. We have bans on certain exports that are crucial in high tech and have both sort of civilian and military applications. I mean, what is then called dual use, airplane spare parts, etc. We are all now also part, of course, of the media war that's going on together with the military war, and in response to that, the EU has banned Sputnik and Russia Today, or they have been suspended. We also seen the list of politicians, and lately both Putin and Lavrov have been put on this sanctions list, as well as members of the Duma, the Security Council, etc., etc. And of course also an ever-expanding list of Russian so-called oligarchs, the billionaires from Russia that we see in the newspapers every now and then at their football clubs or at their yachts or wherever they may be. There has also been restrictions on how people can travel in the region. We have seen that the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2 was put on hold in Germany and has basically filed for bankruptcy because of this. So this is a quite massive list of things, and I mean, this is not even exhaustive, but this is sort of the main areas where we have seen sanctions being introduced so far. So why all of this focus on the banking sector? Well, the banking sector in basically most reasonably modern economies, the banking sector is really what is sort of greasing the wheels of any economy. And on top of that, the assets that they control are often very large in comparison to economic activity. And Russia is not an exception here. And we can see that the total banking assets in Russia is around 80% of GDP. And it varies between years, of course, but that's a ballpark figure. And the 3 largest banks, again, is, as you can see here, Sberbank, VTB, and Gazprom Bank. And as I mentioned before, 2 of these 3 banks were not included on the SWIFT sanction list, which means that sort of bank number 1 and bank number 3 will still be able to do some international transactions. However, Sberbank, for example, cannot raise capital and do other things that banks would normally do in the West. So despite the fact that they're not included in SWIFT, they will not be able to operate like they would normally do. So it's a quite a significant blow to the Russian banking sector, the sanctions that we have seen so far. The other part of sanctions that have been discussed quite heavily is sanctions related to trade. We know that on the export side, Russia gets a lot of its export revenues from exporting oil, gas, and minerals, also grains and other things. But oil and gas are really the two biggest items when it comes to earning export revenues for Russia. Also worth to note here is that we talk a lot about gas, of course, here in Europe because of the pipelines that carry gas here. But oil actually brings almost 3 times as much revenues to Russia in a normal year as gas does. Then you can see the big difference between the two bars. Exports and imports here means that Russia is running a quite significant current account surplus. So it's in the order of 6% of GDP in 2021. So a very large current account surplus. If we think then why do we spend so much time talking about gas? Well, this is part of this explanation, which is that a lot of the pipeline gas from Russia ends up in the large European countries, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and you can see other EU here. So if you add all of these things together, the EU accounts for around 75% of Russian pipeline gas exports. So Europe is a really important market for Russian gas, but at the same time, of course, then these European countries are very dependent on gas coming from Russia. So this makes this sanctions discussion quite complicated for some of our European countries. And it's no secret now that Germany and Italy were two countries that were not so keen on introducing sanctions on SWIFT when this has been discussed. And this part with the pipe gas export gives you pretty good understanding on why this would be the case. We can see that also for crude oil exports, Europe is a big market for Russia, but there, of course, the ties are not as sort of binding as gas pipelines. You can sort of ship oil around the world more easily than you can change pipelines for gas distributions. But again, Europe is a big important market historically also for Russian crude exports. All right, so we now have some idea of what the sanctions are and why they may be targeted in the areas they are. So what has sort of Russia been trying to do to protect itself against sanctions? It's not the case that Russia did not try to prepare for sanctions. They have seen sanctions coming their way before, and now they were trying to do their macroeconomic sort of lesson in preparation for this. So what you can see here is that on the right-hand side, you have international reserves held by the Central Bank of Russia. It amounts to more than $600 billion US, more than 35% of GDP. At the same time, the debt of the government is somewhere in the order of 20 to 25% of GDP. So relatively low compared to many countries in the West. So this was Russia's way of trying to ensure that if it was sanctioned, it would have the resources to deal with these sanctions. They have also built up this national wealth fund, which is basically taking some of the oil money and putting it into a sovereign wealth fund that is sort of similar to other oil exporting countries. And again, I mean, it amounts to quite a lot of money, over 200 billion US dollars in the fall of 2021. One thing to note though is that accumulating reserves is not without its cost to other parts of the economy. So in this chart, you see the blue line is the oil price, Brent is the Brent oil price. The yellowish line is the exchange rate ruble to dollars, and the gray line is international reserves. So you can see that since 2014-15, Russia started to really rebuild its reserves, the gray line going up quite sharply. And if I had been better at making nice charts, you would see that in a normal year, if you look at this chart, when oil prices go up, as they have done in the sort of right-hand part of this chart, in a normal year, the exchange rate would have strengthened. The ruble would have been stronger against other currencies than it is today. And why is this not happening now? Well, it's basically because instead of letting the ruble appreciate when the oil price went up, the central bank was putting more money into its reserves. So it basically means that for people that want to buy goods from the rest of the world or travel, etc., they basically lose out because the central bank is putting more reserves for that rainy day. So what happened so far then? Well, a lot of what is going on in the modern economy, again, is about confidence and trust. And certainly this is the case for a banking system. It's certainly the case for a currency, and it's also the case for how the stock market values the shares of different companies. And even when sanctions are not yet in place, the fact that they have been discussed so widely and have generated so much support means that basically the market and people and companies are already thinking about how to deal with these sanctions. So we basically see a bank run evolving in Russia. People go to the banks, they stand in line to get out their money from the banks. They then try to make something that preserves the value of the money that they get out from the bank. Usually you would go and exchange your local currency for dollars or euros or Swiss francs or something that you think you will preserve its value, or you buy sort of expensive capital goods that you think will keep its value as well. So we have already seen these kind of tendencies. If the Central Bank of Russia had been able to use the reserves that we have just seen, they may have been able to support the ruble from going down in value. But as it is now, when everyone is trying to get out of the rubles, and the central bank basically has its hands tied behind its back because of sanctions, the ruble has basically been in free fall as well as a result of this. So it more than cut the ruble value in half in the last couple of weeks here. So what can then a central bank do when you don't really have access to the international reserves you would use normally? Well, you do what they have done now, which introduce capital controls. So you cannot take your money out of Russia any way you want. You cannot get access to as much foreign exchange that you want. The central bank has also raised its interest rate from 9.5% to 20%. The stock market in Moscow has been closed. It was already falling very significantly, and then they realized that we cannot keep the market open. So we don't really have the latest number of what would be the case if the market was open in Moscow, but several of the important shares are also traded in London. In that market, we have seen share prices falling 90 to 98%. So just unbelievable fall in asset price value. They are not the same papers that are traded in Moscow, but it gives you an indication that anyone who can leave Russian assets right now are trying to do so, basically. Since Russia is such an important exporter of gas and oil, there is also, of course, a very significant impact on gas prices. EU natural gas has gone from 75 to 235 euros per megawatt hours, and the oil price has gone from around $90 per barrel to $128 per barrel just over these last week or 2 weeks. So a very significant impact, of course, also on international energy prices. I'm not going to spend too much time. It's just saying that, again, the exchange rate has really decoupled from the oil price in a way that we're not used to seeing, and as an effect of sanctions. And even before Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw that in the final quarter of 2021, around $18 billion left the country in the private sector last year. So, I mean, people were already getting worried about what was going on in Russia and trying to get their money out of there as quickly as they could. So what happens next? You know, how can we figure out what this will cost in the longer run? Well, it's basically an impossible question. This type of sanctions regime on a country like Russia is rather unique. Although, I mean, we have seen sanctions on countries like Iran and Venezuela and North Korea, Cuba, etc. But I mean, I think Russia really is a special case. So what I'm going to show you now is calculations based on countries that are similar to Russia in income levels, but of course different from Russia in many other ways. But if we just want to have an idea of what this could mean for the Russian economy going forward, I'm going to show you sort of 2 slides here from a paper that I did with my colleague Paulo Maura at the IMF back in 2006, where we basically just looked at when a country has a crisis, this is GDP. This black line is supposed to be GDP in a stylistic form. And you can see that here in 93, you have GDP falling sharply to 96, and then coming back up to where it was before the crisis started at some stage in 97, 98. So here we have shaded a part, and we call this an output loss. So basically, how much GDP would you lose in this period before you get back to where you started? This is a very crude measure of the cost of a crisis. And we can calculate this in a lot of different ways. But basically, this is, I would say, a lower conservative estimate of an output loss that we have in connections to different crises. And what we did back then was basically to look at output losses that were connected to different types of crises. So here on the left, you can see a number of different shocks and crises that hit economies. And the numbers in this table are then how much did this type of crisis cost an emerging markets countries, which is where Russia would be in terms of income levels here. So if you read this table and you look at currency crisis, you can read off the number 68, which is then 68% of the GDP level that the country had when the crisis started. If you look at the banking crisis, the number says 35, debt crisis 101, etc. So now basically Russia is in a situation where it is facing several of these crises at one time, at the same time. And it has limited resources to actually take care of this crisis because of sanctions. And it cannot hope that the IMF or any other international organizations will come to the rescue. So, you know, in my mind, Russia is looking at scenarios where it can cost them more than a full year's worth of GDP for invading Ukraine at this stage, because of the sanctions that are now creating both the currency crisis, the banking crisis, a debt crisis, etc. So this is, of course, just very much, you know, giving an indication of what the cost could be, but it's hard at this stage to really come up with a model that could predict what the cost of this could mean for Russia. But my own view is that this will be extremely costly for the Russian economy and, of course, for the people living in Russia, more importantly. So I will stop there and I will hand back the floor or the screen to Jesper. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Torbjörn, for these very interesting points. There are a number of questions coming in the chat, but I thought I'd start with some questions that have come in before this event, just to sort of get a broad overview of some of the issues now. So the way you explain the Russian economy in normal times and its enormous dependency on oil and gas or energy prices in general, this would make one think that, you know, given the situation right now, when these prices are soaring, wouldn't this predict that this is great news for the Russian economy? So how come this does not, or why should we not expect this to materialize into being actually beneficial due to very high energy prices right now? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you, Jesper. Yeah, that's of course sort of a very relevant question for a country like Russia. I mean, I showed you the chart where you can see that the strong correlation between growth and energy prices. What is problematic now for Russia, though, is that these increases are coming at the time when the banking system is not working. People and companies are really afraid of what's lying ahead. We also have all sorts of transactions between the Russian government and the rest of the world being restricted. So, you know, for this usual transmission of oil prices and oil revenues to GDP growth in Russia, you need, of course, all of these steps where the money that comes in from oil translates into increased consumption, increased investments, a lot of local activities triggered by what is done by consumers and companies, and then, you know, you get your higher growth rate. At this stage, there are so many links in this chain from higher oil prices to growth that have been broken by sanctions that I find it highly unlikely that we will see any positive developments of the Russian economy for quite some time now.
Okay, so on a related note, the fact that the Russian ruble now is depreciating enormously, I mean, it's losing its value. In a normal macro setting, this would be a competitive edge for Russia. Why should we not expect this to happen this time?
Well, again, first of all, Russia does not have so many other things to export than oil, gas, and minerals. It's not so sort of front edge in other big areas relative to these commodities that it is exporting. So, I mean, you would need sort of a manufacturing industry or something else that would really benefit from this depreciation to make sort of the export boost story work. So, already there we have a problem. But of course, with all of the restrictions on financial transactions and the severely damaged confidence among consumers and investors, it's pretty clear that, all of a sudden Russia will not start to export a lot of other things to the world market. So, I mean, it's kind of going to miss out also on that competitive edge that a normal country would gain from a massive devaluation like this.
And this, of course, brings us then to another very broad question, which is, what should our expectations be of other countries sort of stepping in now and starting to trade more with China? Should we expect, to trade with Russia? Bit of Freudian slip there, given that, mentioning the country that most people would think about as a potential trading partner that would be interested in increasing their trade with Russia at this point, being China. How should we think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a bit of room for increased trade with other countries from a Russian perspective. But we still, I mean, even after sort of the Crimea annexation, we saw this start of a shift away from trading with Europe and towards China. So, of course, that process has already started, but it's also a pretty slow process. The European Union is still Russia's biggest trading partner by some margin, also sort of after all of this discussion of the Chinese factor in Russian trade. But of course, at this stage, it's not unreasonable to think that Russia will look for new markets. The problem from the Chinese side, though, is that if it's too sort of Russia friendly at this stage, the EU and the US may come to China and say, look, we don't really appreciate that you help Russia circumvent our sanctions. And then from a Chinese perspective, of course, we have seen that the US and Europe has an economy that's combined is 23 times the Russian economy. So if China wants to keep exporting and doing trade and business with the West, it risks a market that's 23 times the size of the Russian market to be nice to Russia. And I don't think the Chinese or many of these other countries in the BRICS club are so inclined to help Russia and be some welfare supporter of Russia in a circumstance like this, if it comes at the cost of not being sort of so friendly with the West, basically. It could come at a very high cost to China and other spaces. So
looking then at sort of the other side here, I think you paint a very convincing picture that the costs to Russia and Russia's economy would be very, very large. But how about the impact on Western economies, and in particular when it comes then to energy in countries like Germany and Italy, first and foremost? what would you say are the sort of realistic alternatives to shifting away from imports from Russia, and what kind of time perspective are we looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question, of course. I mean, we already see how how energy prices are going through the roof, and you know, we can just take our car over to the gas station and see that we're paying prices that we have never seen before. So many of us and countries around the world, not only in the West, of course, but the rest of the world, will basically have to deal with a significant increase in energy prices. Normally, this would, of course, have a cooling down effect of the global economy. I think we now have, you know, in Sweden and other countries, we do have some fiscal room to maneuver in the sense that we can support our consumers or companies to sort of lessen the impact of these high energy prices. But again, you know, it's not cost-free to sanction a country like Russia because of its vast energy exports, that's for sure. But I think also that thankfully the European Union and the US, they have agreed that we are willing to take this cost to make sanctions really bite for Russia. And this is, I think, a quite strong and important signal that we're sending now to Russia.
What about specifically Swedish impacts of this crisis? There are some questions about how will the Swedish economy in particular be hit, or is there anything in particular in terms of Swedish relations to Russia that you'd like to mention as important here?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like we said, energy prices we already see, of course, and I think the government needs to think pretty carefully about how they support people through this. Fortunately, maybe for a lot of us, this is an election year, and usually we know that, you know, fiscal support is more easily distributed when there's an election coming up. So maybe this will also be the case here. But I mean, here it's also very well motivated by the fact that we need to have a united front against Russia. Then on sort of a more micro level, there are, of course, both companies and people that have significant investments in Russia, and they will in many cases have very significant losses as well in relations to these investments. So, you know, we have seen that some reports of people that said that they had significant parts of the pension in Russian stock markets or funds, etc. So, you know, that's going to be painful for those individuals and companies that had this exposure to Russia, of course. We could also see scenarios when a financially distressed Russian system can have spillover effects to the rest of Europe. And even if it's not Swedish banks that have the greatest exposure to Russian banks, if other banks in Europe have big exposure, and we know, of course, that Austrian and Italian banks and some other banking systems are more exposed, we could have effects spreading through the European banking system. But again, given the size of the Russian economy, the European Union should be able to handle these things if it's done in the right way.
So speaking of individuals being affected, one of the types of sanctions are sanctions against individuals, very wealthy individuals in Russia. So first, a technical point which was brought up here in the Q&A function is, are we to think of this as being freezes of these individuals' assets, or are these also, could this also be a case of actual confiscation of assets of individuals? So is this basically them not getting access as long as the sanctions are in place, and then as the sanctions are lifted, then everything's back to normal, kind of? Or is this a more substantial thing? I mean,
no, I mean, what has been said so far is, of course, that it's a freeze on assets, and it includes these famous yachts that are worth billions and billions of kroners, or whatever currency you want to count them in. So that is an asset freeze, and it's not the confiscation, the permanent nationalization, if you want, of assets. Russia on its side is saying that it's may nationalize some assets by Western interests. We'll see what happens with that. But in principle, it should be the case that once Russia is not invading Ukraine, so sanctions can be lifted, asset freezes will be gone. But yeah, we'll see how this develops.
And also then following up on that, the sanctions and their impact, how should we think about the longer run impact of these sanctions? I mean, is it a question of, okay, sanctions are in place now, they're going to affect the economy very severely, but then as soon as we lift the sanctions, everything will go back to normal? Or how would you think about that kind of questions? Should we think of this as a more longer run impact on the economy and the relations?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's important to understand why the sanctions will be lifted, which is, of course, ending the war in Ukraine. So I think, if that happens already, that's a relief. But, to rebuild the confidence that has now been lost by all sorts of investors, both Russian and foreign, and trading partners and partners in terms of research and development, what have you, I think this type of confidence will take some time to rebuild, even if and when Russia is stopping the aggression in Ukraine. So I mean, it's going to be most likely a pretty long road before Russia is back to sort of some normal level of trust in the markets.
Okay, let's see. There are many questions coming in here. So in terms of the costs for the European Union countries or Europe in general, in economic terms, you had some estimates on the sort of order of magnitude in the Russian economy. Do you have equivalent estimates of the impact on the European economy?
No, not really. I mean, we are basically facing this enormous increase in energy prices, but I think it's down to European policymakers to not make that transform into a sort of an economic crisis in Europe. And I think at this stage we do have sort of both the monetary and fiscal tools to deal with it, but it's not. It will lead to significant costs in Europe if policymakers are not doing the right thing. So it's going to put sort of them in the spotlight going forward.
Some questions here about potential winners from this kind of crisis. Some speculations that this plays into the hands of China or the US, or what would you say to this?
Yeah, I don't think it's of course there will be some companies that, for example, are selling defense material. I mean, they are clearly seeing their share prices increasing. Alternative producers of energy would be a natural set of companies that would benefit from increases in energy prices. So, you know, you can go down that list if you want. I don't think that sort of entire countries will necessarily benefit from this. I think this constitutes a major disruption of the global economy, no matter how we're thinking about it. It's going to affect both, you know, the energy markets, but also global finance and other trade deals. So my general assessment is that this is bad news for the global economy, basically.
So one very important thing, which is not sort of directly connected to the economy here, but it's sort of indirectly connected, has to do with the popular support for sanctions, or well, both popular support for sanctions in the West, but also then popular support to the extent we think that exists in Russia for this war. What's your take on the media situation, and how easy or difficult is it for people to get information about this, and what does that mean for Russia's possibilities to sustain this situation?
Well, I think we all have heard how sort of divided the Russian information sphere is between sort of the older generations watching TV and the younger ones going online to find their information in different locations. One thing that has now been discussed apparently in Russia is to restrict the internet access. So, you know, that could potentially limit what information sources are available. At the same time, of course, we have limited sort of the traditional propaganda machinery in terms of RT and Sputnik here in the West and sort of other parts. So yeah, I think we do have an information war that will be quite important as an ingredient in this actual war going on in Ukraine. And at this stage, I think a lot of people are praising the information efforts by the Ukrainian government, and they're sort of a little bit making fun of the Russian ones. But this is a serious story that we need to keep an eye on. But I don't really have an answer of how this will end, of course.
No. What about your assessment of the popular support for sanctions in the West? Do you think that, is there any signs or anything that would sort of point in the direction of people being more willing to sort of support these sanctions now than otherwise, or vice versa?
I mean, I see some reports saying that there is quite a strong support in the West for sanctions. And I think, you know, at this early stage, when we get so much sort of war reporting from Ukraine, it really makes us feel that it's important to do something to counter these aggressions in Ukraine. So I think, you know, at this stage, we're certainly willing to pay a higher price at the gas station and things like that, and support sanctions. But I mean, going forward, of course, it's going to be important that our policymakers try to limit sort of the economic pain in the West to make sure that the support for sanction keeps going.
Okay, so I see that we're now at 1 minute to 6. That means our time is unfortunately up. Apologies if I did not manage to raise all the questions in the Q&A function here. I'm sure if you want to turn to Torbjörn or myself, you're more than welcome to send any additional questions by email, etc. Also, I'd like to say that at site, we're certainly planning on having more events and webinars in the days and weeks to come. Now on Thursday, though the link has not been distributed yet, there's a webinar with the title Russian Oil and Gas, What to Expect, which is explicitly about the question of what are the alternatives for diversifying away from Russian oil and gas, and getting some numbers on this very important dimension of this. So for those of you with a special interest in that, I'll tune in to that on Thursday and have a look at our website for other events to come. With that, it's 6 o'clock, and I would like to thank you all for tuning in to this. And thanks, of course, to Torbjörn for very insightful points on this, on the economic sanctions side and the economic side of this terrible conflict that we hope will end soon. With that, I thank you all, and we end this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.